Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a major update as it pertains to the Russia Ukraine conflict in Eastern Europe. There was a big escalation by Ukraine with a wide scale drone strike deep within Russian territory, targeting bases, with it being called, some Russians saying it was the Russian Pearl Harbor. Now, that seems to be a big overreaction, but that's just to give you the scale of this attack. And we have Trump. Initially, it was reported by all the big mainstream media. Trump did not know this drone strike was going to happen. But behind the scenes, it seems like many people are saying, well, he perhaps did, considering the United States has been giving Ukraine intelligence updates. There's some reports that Ukraine notified Hegseth in advance, and you wouldn't think Ukraine would do a wide-scale attack like this without the U.S. behind them, even if Trump doesn't publicly want to get behind it because it could fracture his relationship with Russia when he's attempting this peace negotiation. There was another negotiating period, a meeting that happened earlier this afternoon in Istanbul, which only lasted an hour. And you can see all the major NATO Western European countries now, with Starmer coming out and saying they are war fighting ready. And so you can take this a number of ways. You look at this just as kind of a blanket statement. Oh, this is the escalation. This is World War III. That's what many people are saying. But you lift behind the curtain, you understand that Trump has been trying to get these peace negotiations to go forward for months. Hegseth, Trump, Rubio, Vance, they've all said the same thing. They said, initially, if we don't get some form of a ceasefire, this was probably a month ago, if we don't get a ceasefire, we're going to walk away. They've tried everything. Nothing has worked. And so there is this thought of escalation to de-escalate. And that would be what Ukraine is doing right now. The question is, this hypothetically gives Russia a chance to seriously respond. And from what I've heard, the response could be devastating from the Russians in terms of these strikes. You can see in Russia airfield attacks, Ukraine aims for strategic and symbolic blow. Currently, the full extent of the damage is still unknown, but this operation, they're saying it shows that Ukraine is, I mean, this is all NATO technology too, which is why NATO in the West is truly entrenched into this war now, in something that many people said Trump should not be. But let's just do a big picture. Let's understand where we're at right now when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Russia. I've seen the peace proposal from both the Russians and the Ukrainians, or at least the outline, the rumored peace deal. They're so far off. Ukraine is not recognizing any occupied land right now in terms of a peace negotiation. They still want, they've talked about getting Crimea back. They're talking about getting all this land back. It's just not going to happen without serious capitulation from the Russians. And how would capitulation happen if there is no NATO direct involvement with troops? There have been NATO countries signaling to Trump that they should send troops into Ukraine as kind of a escalation through de-escalation, to where they're not going to fight, but if anything, see, this is the problem. It's like a booby trap, and that's what people were saying, to where you can't have the troops there, because if there's any interaction, then you are talking about World War III. You don't want the NATO troops interacting with the Russians, but then these Western European countries are just so obsessed with Russia. The biggest problem in terms of this NATO agreement is the viewpoint of where we view Russia in terms of their strategic, like the strategic allotment of how much land we allow them to have, and really just our view on how strong Russia is in terms of raw overall power when it comes to their threat level against the United States versus their threat level against the other European countries. The other European countries are very scared about Russia because of their invasion of Ukraine, and so they want a serious force to stop any advancement, as opposed to the United States, to where we're in a different spot. We can sacrifice 1/5 of Ukraine as long as we prevent some type of widespread war within Europe, which would directly affect the United States, because it would be, I mean, you're talking about a global war at that point. So there's a lot to talk about, and you could understand the viewpoint if you are Trump, to where it seems like, if you read between the lines, in some way, because of the amount of intelligence the United States and Ukraine share. Remember the mineral deal, so technically anything that we give them in terms of funding, we are supposedly going to be getting back in terms of rare earths. We have a direct relationship with them. Why would they, after signing this mineral deal to finally get back on Trump's so-called good side, and Trump's trying to play both sides, this is the whole thing with negotiations. You try and play both sides. Why would Ukraine not tell the United States if they were going to do a crazy attack that potentially escalated the war and gave the Russians a clear chance to respond? The idea is you show the Russians, because Putin has not wanted to come to the negotiating table, and I do want to identify an interesting thing that we're seeing in terms of the way some of the MAGA base is splitting with Trump on this war, because originally the entrenched belief was that, well, we're sending way too much money to Ukraine, we need to stop this. It's really Ukraine, they're the ones prolonging this, but Ukraine agrees to the ceasefire about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. Russia doesn't. They initially agreed to an infrastructure ceasefire. It lasted about a week. There was fighting. It broke immediately. And so Trump views Russia, and a lot of people are saying he's getting a lot of Western influence propaganda in terms of how he's viewing this conflict, because if you remember, he didn't mention at all whether or not you view it as an assassination attempt, whatever it was, when Putin visited the Kursk region and there was a so-called assassination attempt against him. That was reported by Russian media. Trump didn't talk about it at all. He just said, well, Russia, they're the one escalating. And he was referencing something that happened before that potential assassination attempt, but he still hasn't mentioned whether it was an assassination attempt or not. It's really muddled. Ukraine denies it, of course, but Russia says that's exactly what it was because they knew where he was. And so we're seeing kind of a fracture within the party in terms of there's a lot of people that are entrenched that no, we need to end this any means necessary. The problem with ending it any means necessary, or the United States, I mean, the U.S. could walk away, but that, depending on where, the thing is, we have this mineral deal. You could break the mineral deal and say, we're done. This has escalated too far. We're not involved. You're not really fracturing anything within NATO because Ukraine is not a NATO country. I'll tell you what, I was hit with a bombardment of like all of these Western people talking about how they wanted desperately Ukraine to join NATO. I don't know if they were bots or what, but it was insane. I got to this weird part of X and it was like, and every post was getting like 20K likes, and it's just join NATO, they should be in NATO. And it's like, we are talking about full nuclear, potentially nuclear war. When you talk about striking the nuclear bases like Ukraine is doing with the drones, this is going to put, you're going to push Russia to the brink to where, well, the thing is, this is what the West will say. They'll say, well, Putin would never do that because he'd destroy his own country. And the problem is, if Putin deems himself pushed to the brink in terms of, I know there's a lot of pressure within Russia and for Putin and for the Russians to get more land within Ukraine based off of their current expenditures in terms of military-wise. And that's a lot of the reason why Putin will not agree to a ceasefire. Obviously, if it's Russia against Ukraine, Russia is going to have a significant advantage in terms of manpower. That's why the Ukrainians, we see videos of them taking people from the street, dragging them into vans, forcing them to fight, because they just have nobody at this point. When you compare the countries, when you compare their sizes, it's not close to a fair fight, even though Ukraine is getting all of this intelligence help. And that's why I think behind the scenes we're seeing Trump possibly know about this strike, but in terms of the public, they're going to report and they're going to say, and all the mainstream media is going to say, well, Trump didn't know about this. You know, Trump doesn't want to destroy his relationship with Putin. That's the other thing. But at some point, push comes to shove. If Putin's not going to be in agreement, if you want to walk away, you can walk away. But Trump did say he did want peace in this. But at some point, I will say, depending on what Russia demands and what these Western European countries don't want to give up, I mean, what can you really do? This is just going to be solved, unfortunately, on the battlefield. There's really not a ton, because they're saying they did sanction Russia to death. Now there's talk of more sanctions. You've got Lindsey Graham visiting with Zelensky. This is like 2022 all over again. You've got a neocon visiting Zelensky, talking about how we're going to ramp up 500% tariff against the Russians. Now there's threats, and this is what I said was going to happen. I said Trump was going to try and get India and China to stop buying Russian oil, because in terms of energy exports, those two countries are heavily, if you can cut those countries off from Russia, it's going to significantly weaken Russia. But I don't know if China would want to do that, considering why would the Chinese appease the United States based off of our situation in terms of the trade war, although that has been cooled down to where it's a 10%, 30% retaliatory tariff on each of the countries. But listen, when it comes to this, it's very complicated. You can understand the escalation in the sense of the West is saying the problem is the United States is in a different viewpoint than the Western European NATO countries. So it's like, it's hard to really compare, but there is the common belief that, well, Putin does not want to come to the negotiating table right now. He won't negotiate a ceasefire without an outline of a peace deal. That's mainly because he has such a significant advantage in terms of just overall manpower. Why would he stop his armies from fighting to do some measly 30-day ceasefire if the Ukrainians and these Western European countries say, no, you must return Crimea and the 4 oblasts, which they say is not going to happen at all. They can't have that, because obviously they've spent a lot in terms of getting those areas, and this goes back to the historical context, the 2014 revolution that happened there, and then even before that with Ukraine originally being under the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. You could even argue before that, but the point of it is we've got a situation, and you can say the areas in which we're struck. I mean, this is interior Russia. You can see there's a lot of conflicting reports. People don't know exactly what happened. Ukraine says 117 drones were used in the attacks. It's called Operation Spider's Web. And that 41 Russian aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Russian military bloggers played down the damage. Honestly, I thought they played it up. If you looked at some of the stuff that they were saying it was catastrophic. But you can see this other stuff. Trump mulls sanctions on Russia. You've got the peace talks, which have been ongoing. The thought is that there is the potential that this escalation could result in peace, but that's another risk you're taking. You know, this is almost like back to the liberal square one, which is what they originally wanted to do. Now, the difference is the liberals said, well, you need to get back all the territory. It's not possible unless you send NATO troops in, which would be potentially catastrophic escalation. But there is the viewpoint of, well, you have to be stronger against Putin, because Trump comes in, immediately tries to negotiate peace. It goes nowhere. He threatens everything. He says, well, we're just not going to negotiate anymore. We're done. We're stepping away if there's no ceasefire. There's no ceasefire. They're still negotiating. So who knows exactly what will happen here. But it does seem like now Trump is saying, well, maybe it is escalation to de-escalate when it comes to Putin. And the problem is you're not going to get that territory back. That's what liberals want. They want these liberals, I'm talking about not the United States liberals, although them too, but the more important ones are the ones in Europe, of the major powers, of the UK, of France, of Germany. Because of their location relative to Russia, they don't want to give up an inch. But how does that work? I mean, you're going to have to at some point. There has to be some negotiation. There's going to have to be some crack when it comes to what each country, Ukraine and Russia, give up. You know, there were originally the escalate. You could argue this was the other escalation we were talking about in terms of this war. If you just want to go timeline, the most recent one before this, you could say, was right after Trump won, when the United States, along with the Western European powers, authorized the long-range ballistic missiles into Russia. And the reason that was done, I think, was because they knew Trump was going to come in and try and negotiate peace, so they wanted to give Ukraine more leverage in peace negotiations. So could this be the same thing? But what is Russia? What are the Russians going to do in response to this? We'll have to see. But I mean, I think it's clear that whatever you want to say, Russia said there's really no point in us ending this when we have such a big advantage in terms of militarily with overall manpower. With this war now 3 years in, we're not interested in doing any type of ceasefire without immediate assurances that there will be. And to me, the biggest thing, you could talk about the territory. People say the territory is the biggest thing. Okay, although there are a lot of Russian speaking people in that area, and I know that's a bad precedent to set. I get it, because then you've got major powers taking over areas. But this is you're talking about NATO encroachment. You're talking about Western influence to overthrow a pro-Russian government in 2014. I mean, this is stuff that happened. So let's solve this. let's let them have the 1/5 area, and that's like, oh, this is Nazi Germany. We're talking about two different things. I mean, it's 1/5 of Ukraine. With the Nazis, it was the real remilitarization of the Rhineland. It was originally the armistice that turned into the horrible Treaty of Versailles, where they were given assurances on certain things they didn't get. Then it was 1/3 of Czechoslovakia annexed, all of Czechoslovakia invaded, half of Poland, Austria annexed. So we're talking about two different things. They're trying to compare them. It's a fear-mongering tactic. So, but we just want this solved, okay? And maybe this escalation will help Putin, force Putin to the negotiating table. Although it could just allow Russia to. The problem is, if there's no NATO direct involvement, why would Russia feel all that threatened? If there's no NATO troop involvement, I just don't see. I mean, hopefully, the only thing you could think of is, well, their economy collapses, and that's the whole idea with sanctions, and that's why Trump's going to try and hit them harder with sanctions, and this is all to pressure Putin. The strikes are to pressure Putin. This is to pressure Putin to get him to the negotiating table. The problem is there going to be any agreement? You know, Russia still wants Ukraine demilitarized. How is that going to happen? How are the Western European countries going to agree to that? Is that where Trump has to really bully them into an agreement? Because these countries, along with Ukraine, which is like their lapdog right now, you know, Ukraine can only be as powerful as these Western European countries and the United States allow them to be. That's why they're ambitious right now. They obviously have serious backing. Ukraine initially in 2022 in the Istanbul talks was going to agree to some type of ceasefire that could have led to a peace deal, but Boris Johnson said, no, don't do it. We're going to sanction them to death and their economy is going to be destroyed. That was the whole idea. The original strategy was a wait out campaign of the Russians because they were hitting them with sanctions. It didn't work. So now what is the future of this? We'll have to see. But listen, this is another escalation. We'll see where this leads. And you could argue, well, now that things are getting louder, that means we're closer to peace. But you could also say, well, this is more of an escalation. Now Putin's not going to trust Trump. And there's no chance at a peace deal because we know that Trump, in some way, because of the intelligence reports, even though it's being reported by the mainstream media, and certainly I'm sure the United States wants it to be reported this way, that Trump had no clue of this attack. But you would have to think behind the scenes, that Trump, because of his rhetoric in terms of him saying, I don't know what happened to Putin, something happened to him, we were talking and he's bombing Kiev. So what Trump has said in terms of his sentiment, it's been very pro-Ukraine recently and anti-Putin, anti-Russia, and it just goes back to the original ceasefire. But you can understand the Russian point of view. Why would they agree to a ceasefire if there's no chance of a peace deal and they have such a huge advantage in terms of the battlefield with overall manpower? Why would they stop their armies if we're not there's things to where you want them demilitarized. There's no way there's going to be an agreement on that right now. I just don't see it. I don't see the Western European countries who are propping up Ukraine right now agreeing to that unless Trump comes in and bullies it to happen, to have them demilitarized. But the other thing is, it's like they won't, and I think a lot of this is just negotiations. If you're Ukraine, you're going to posture and say, we're not going to give up anything. The only time you give it up is if it's an exchange. They both have to agree to certain things. But at this point, it's like, you know, I equated it to like an 80-20. Russia gets 80% of their demands. Ukraine gets 20% of theirs. It's based off of the countries and how strong they are in terms of their military. Russia is a lot stronger than Ukraine. So if they negotiate some type of peace deal, it's going to be heavily favoring Russia unless NATO troops get involved. But then you're risking World War III. So that's really the situation on how I would break down. But either way, guys, make sure you like the video down below. Also follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.